When we talk about the Sustainable Growth Commission, we have to realise that it's actually been really vague on what that actually means. Does it mean that we shall have an economy that is growing, but is doing so in a way that is resulting in an economy that is sustainable, that is environmental and is protecting the planet, even while it's growing, bearing in mind that we live on a finite planet with finite resources? Or does it simply mean that we are creating an economy that is growing indefinitely, that the growth is indefinitely sustained? The Growth Commission itself hasn't really been able to decide which one of those two it is. And if it's the former, if it's trying to create an ecologically sustainable society and economy, I mean, there have been several reports now saying that you cannot do that indefinitely on a finite planet.
The report of the Scottish Growth Commission that came out well over a year ago now, the most important thing that it recommended was that Scotland should not have a separate currency at the time that it becomes independent, but should over a period acclimatise itself to the idea that it might have a currency but use sterling in the meantime. This was the notorious policy of sterlingisation, which I have never agreed with. What are the alternatives? Now, the Scottish Currency Group, of which I am a member, is putting forward the idea that we should be looking at a situation where Scotland moves very rapidly after independence, in a matter of weeks, towards having its own currency that floats freely against the pound sterling and against every other currency in the world. This is a model that works. But what is more, it's a policy that delivers independence for Scotland. Scotland, shackled by the pound, would still be hopping to the tune hummed by London. And that is not, I am sure, what those who will be campaigning for independence want. What campaigners for independence want is a Scotland free to choose its own economic path that reflects its own social path. I believe that no country on earth has ever become independent because it wants to carry on with the social and economic model of the country from which it has departed. It does instead wish to pursue its own distinct personal, in the sense of representing the agenda of the people of the country, agenda that will represent their needs, their wants, their desires, and the type of society that they want to live in.
Democracy thrives on diversity. There's strength in diversity. There's strength in the diversity of opinion from people coming from different backgrounds and viewpoints, all putting their ideas together and hopefully coming out with something that is stronger than any one of them could have come out with themselves. So by critically analysing our friends and not disparaging them as being the opposition all the time, we can create an independence that genuinely works for all of us, that pulls all of us along on that journey.
In my view, one of the problems with the Growth Commission report is it's a bit more of the same of slightly better, and it leaves all of the vested interests, the financial sector, land ownership sector, the wealthy, the elites of Scotland completely unchallenged, and as they are. So in that sense, it's going to go down, or did go down extremely well with all of those communities, and it was therefore welcomed by people like the Tory party as a dose of realism in the discussion about Scotland's future. Maybe start with the discussion about Section B, which is to do with the Scottish Government deficit and how we would bring the finances onto what they describe as a sustainable footing. And just as a note, when it's called the Sustainable Growth Commission, you might think that's to do with the environment and climate change and so forth, but it isn't. It means financially sustainable. So a classic sort of neoliberal, neoclassical economic view of the world purely in terms of money, rather than, say, the environment and people's welfare. So Section B starts from an entirely false assumption that a government deficit is a bad thing and that your overwhelming priority is to deal with the deficit. And therefore it starts from the GERS report and suggests that, according to that, because of what the UK dumps on us, that we'd start off with an 8 or 9% deficit And therefore, our priority over the first 10 years is to reduce that to 3%, which is some sort of magic rule that 3% is a good number, whereas 8% is a bad number. And it's just not true. I think when you consider the COVID situation this year, the UK has gone back to Second World War levels of spending, which means we've been running a deficit of nearly 20% of GDP, not 8%, not 3%, 20%. And has the world come to an end? Well, certainly not because of the deficit. Might have come to an end because of COVID, but the financial side of things has gone on as usual. There's no inflation. The running the deficit has simply allowed the Chancellor to provide things like the furlough scheme, support for business, and all the things that the government should be doing. Is that deficit a problem? No. The interest rate is the lowest it's ever been in 300 years. And the government is borrowing at about 0.5% interest. So the cost effectively of those loans is essentially zero. Much of them has been provided by the Bank of England in any case, which is simply part of the government. And you can't really owe money to yourself. So some 900 billion is effectively just written off and will never be repaid. So if you get rid of that assumption that deficits are bad, because they're not, a household deficit, my deficit, if I overspend the credit card, is a bad thing. But a government deficit is completely different. The government is the creator of the money. It creates money by spending. By running a deficit, it creates more money for us. And a government deficit is simply a private surplus. So that means that I can get and you can get to the end of the month and have a little bit of money left over. And that is surely a much better thing than a government surplus, in which case the government accumulates a bit of money and we all go into debt instead. So, if you look at it like that, then you start to see that, the normal situation to have a healthy economy and a newly independent Scotland developing successfully is that you need to have a government deficit. And in the early years of independence, we have to do a lot of repairing of damage caused by the Tories over the last 30 or 40 years. We need to invest in the economy. Denmark has something like 50,000 core civil servants. We only have 8,000. So we maybe need 42,000 new civil service jobs. The buildings, the infrastructure, the furniture, canteens, IT equipment, and all the rest of it to go with that. Maybe something like 2 or 3 billion of spending by the Scottish government to provide that infrastructure. That's going to be contracts going left, right, and centre all over the country. The new Ministry of Agriculture in Dumfries maybe having 800 jobs going to that part of the country. Coast Guard headquarters in Stornoway. The Ministry of Energy going to Aberdeen with perhaps 2,000 jobs or something. That's all money, work, investment going into our pockets. Half of it goes straight back to the Scottish government in extra taxes, which helps in the long term to reduce your deficit as a sort of self-correcting task. And I think all of that investment in the economy would produce a post-independence boom. None of that features really in the Growth Commission report.
Yeah. Right now, Scotland is quite rightly focused on the current crisis that is the coronavirus pandemic. But as we come out of that, we have to recognise that just a few years from now, we will hit the irreversible tipping point of the climate emergency. We have less than a decade now to make serious inroads into fixing that problem. So the solution of getting us out of the pandemic has to be the one that also gets us out of the climate emergency. So reaching back to something like the Growth Commission report that came out pre-pandemic, that doesn't really tackle the problems of the climate emergency, it's just shown itself to be an obsolete report even before it's implemented. So we need to use, all of the resources of Scotland and all of the tools that Scotland has to offer to turn Scotland into that Green New Deal country that we need to survive the climate emergency, but also recognising that the solution for that will be one that leads us to a better, happier, more equal society.
I started doing an anatomical sciences degree in 2011. Then in 2018, the Growth Commission came out and I started to dissect the Growth Commission and realised there was some quite essential economic anatomy missing from that. So the British economy is in a critical condition. One of the reasons is that there has been a serious effort to hide currency abroad, tax havenry. Our economy in the UK is tipped very much towards what's called a rentier economy. So people literally sitting on assets and taking money in from assets that are fundamentally not doing anything very useful. And that's not a good situation for any country to be in. That's quite a negative situation. And it's not the situation you'll find if you live in Germany or in the Netherlands. It's not the same. So that's something that we really have to address. It has to change. A central bank is essential for a country to function. A central bank which creates its own currency is really, you could analyze it with the bone marrow of a body where the blood cells are created. Essentially, your currency is the blood that is going around your body. A country needs its own currency that it produces and controls. Your government produces its currency, and the reason it's valuable is because you will pay tax. That's why your currency has value per se. So the currency of a country should be used for useful purposes, not for giving away to the friends of people who are in government, which is something we're seeing quite a lot of just now. The currency should be used to educate your doctors, your nurses, your teachers. It should be used to build bridges, your roads, your infrastructure. It should be used to pay people to do this, to make your country into an efficient place and a pleasant place to live.